Sarah Martinez had always been smaller than her peers, but what she lacked in size, she made up for in determination. At 24, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a lean build that most people would describe as delicate. Her dark hair was usually pulled back in a tight ponytail, and her brown eyes held a quiet intensity that few people bothered to notice. To most observers, she looked like any other young woman you might see at a coffee shop or walking through a college campus. But Sarah wasn't just any young woman. She was 3 months into the most grueling military training program in the world, and she was the only female in her class attempting to become a Navy SEAL. The journey to this point had been anything but easy. Growing up in a small town in Texas, Sarah had always been drawn to challenges that others said were impossible. While other girls her age were interested in typical teenage activities, Sarah spent her time rock climbing, practicing martial arts, and pushing her body to its physical limits. Her father, a retired Marine, had taught her that strength wasn't just about muscle mass, but about mental toughness and the will to never give up. When Sarah announced her intention to join the military and pursue special operations, most people in her hometown thought she was crazy. Her high school guidance counselor suggested she consider a career in nursing or teaching instead. Even some military recruiters seemed skeptical when she walked into their offices, but Sarah had done her research. She knew that women were now allowed to attempt SEAL training, even though none had successfully completed the program yet. The first few weeks of training had been exactly as brutal as she had expected. The instructors pushed every trainee to their breaking point and beyond. They ran for miles in the sand, carrying heavy boats over their heads. They spent hours in the frigid ocean water until their lips turned blue and their bodies shook uncontrollably. They crawled under barbed wire, climbed ropes until their hands bled, and performed endless push-ups and sit-ups. Many of the men in her class were bigger and initially stronger than Sarah, but she quickly proved that she belonged there. While others complained about the cold water, she gritted her teeth and endured it. When others wanted to quit during the long runs, she kept putting one foot in front of the other. Her technique was often better than her male counterparts because she had to rely on efficiency rather than brute force. The instructors, hardened veterans who had seen thousands of trainees come and go, began to take notice of the small woman who never quit. They threw everything they had at her, expecting her to ring the bell that would signal her withdrawal from the program. Instead, she adapted and overcame every challenge they presented. But not everyone was impressed with Sarah's performance. Among her fellow trainees, opinions were divided. Some respected her determination and began to see her as an equal team member. Others, however, felt threatened by her presence and believed she was receiving special treatment because of her gender. The most vocal critic was Marcus Thompson, a 26-year-old from Alabama who stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed nearly 200 pounds. Marcus had played football in college and believed that his size and strength made him a natural fit for the SEALs. He had grown up believing that certain roles were meant for men only, and he saw Sarah's presence in the program as a political statement rather than a legitimate pursuit of military excellence. Marcus wasn't openly hostile towards Sarah in front of the instructors, but during breaks and informal moments, he made his opinions known. He would make comments about how the standards must be different for women, or how she would never be able to carry a wounded teammate to safety. Other trainees sometimes laughed at his remarks, while others remained uncomfortably silent. Sarah heard these comments but chose not to respond. She had learned long ago that the best way to deal with doubters was to let her actions speak for themselves. She focused on her training, constantly working to improve her performance and prove that she deserved to be there. The training facility was located on a sprawling military base that housed multiple special operations programs. The SEAL training area included obstacle courses, shooting ranges, swimming pools, and vast stretches of beach where trainees practiced amphibious operations. The atmosphere was intense and competitive, with every trainee knowing that the majority of them would not make it through the program. Days began before dawn with physical training sessions that would challenge Olympic athletes. Trainees ran obstacle courses that included climbing walls, rope traverses, and crawling under barbed wire. They practiced combat swimming in pools and open water, learning to move silently and efficiently through aquatic environments. Weapons training was conducted with various firearms, from pistols to assault rifles to specialized equipment used by special operations forces. The mental challenges were just as demanding as the physical ones. Trainees were subjected to stress scenarios designed to test their decision-making abilities under pressure. They practiced navigation in challenging environments, learned to work as teams under extreme conditions, and were constantly evaluated on their leadership potential. Through it all, Sarah continued to perform at a high level. Her swimming scores were among the best in the class, her marksmanship was excellent, and her ability to remain calm under pressure impressed even the most skeptical instructors. She had a natural talent for reading situations quickly and making smart tactical decisions. But as the weeks progressed, the tension between Sarah and Marcus continued to build. Other trainees began to notice the underlying conflict, though most chose to stay out of it. The instructors, focused on pushing everyone to their limits, seemed unaware of the interpersonal dynamics developing within the class. Marcus became increasingly frustrated as Sarah continued to excel in areas where he expected her to fail. When she outperformed him on endurance runs, he claimed it was because women had different standards. When she scored higher on written exams, he suggested she was getting extra help. His comments became more frequent and more pointed, but he was careful to make them when instructors weren't around. Sarah's strategy of ignoring Marcus's behavior was becoming more difficult to maintain. She could see that his comments were affecting some of the other trainees, and she worried that the negativity might impact team cohesion during critical training exercises. But she also knew that any direct confrontation could be used against her by those who already questioned her place in the program. The training facility had strict rules about conflict between trainees. Fighting was grounds for immediate dismissal, regardless of who started it or what the circumstances were. Sarah understood that if she responded to Marcus's provocations with physical force, she would likely be the one blamed and removed from the program. This knowledge made her feel somewhat trapped, forced to endure behavior that would not be tolerated in most other environments. As the 4th month of training approached, the exercises became even more challenging and realistic. Trainees were subjected to scenarios that closely mimicked real combat situations, complete with live ammunition, explosives, and extremely high stress levels. The margin for error became smaller, and the consequences of mistakes became more serious. It was during this period that Sarah's true test would come, though she didn't know it yet. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would change everything. Not just for her, but for the entire concept of women in special operations. Her months of training, her lifetime of preparation, and her unshakable determination were about to be put to the ultimate test in a way she never could have anticipated. The other trainees continued their daily routines, unaware that they were about to witness something that would challenge their assumptions about strength, capability, and what it truly meant to be a warrior. Sarah went to sleep that night focused on the next day's training, having no idea that her quiet perseverance was about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible. The 4th month of SEAL training brought with it a new level of intensity that tested every aspect of a trainee's physical and mental capabilities. The class had already been reduced from its original 60 members to just 28, and the pressure on the remaining candidates was immense. Each day brought new challenges designed to identify weaknesses and eliminate those who couldn't meet the demanding standards. Sarah had not only survived this attrition, but had emerged as one of the top performers in her class. Her small frame moved with practiced efficiency through obstacle courses that left larger trainees exhausted. Her endurance was remarkable, her tactical thinking sharp, and her ability to remain composed under extreme stress had earned grudging respect from most of her peers. But Marcus Thompson's resentment had only grown stronger. What had started as skepticism about women in combat roles had evolved into a personal vendetta against Sarah specifically. He couldn't accept that she was outperforming him in nearly every metric that mattered. His ego, built on years of being the biggest and strongest person in any room, was crumbling under the reality that physical size alone wasn't enough to excel in this environment. The tension reached a critical point during the urban warfare training phase. This portion of the program took place in a specially constructed facility designed to replicate city environments where SEALs might operate. The mock buildings were complete with multiple floors, narrow hallways, hidden passages, and realistic details that made the training scenarios feel authentic and dangerous. Trainees were divided into small teams and given complex mission objectives that required coordination, stealth, and split-second decision-making. They used simulated ammunition and wore protective gear, but the scenarios were designed to be as realistic as possible. Mistakes in these exercises could result in serious injury, so every trainee was expected to maintain complete focus and professionalism. Sarah had been assigned to a team that included Marcus and 3 other trainees. The mission objective was to clear a building complex that supposedly contained high-value targets while avoiding civilian casualties. It was the type of operation that real SEALs might face in hostile territory, where every decision could mean the difference between mission success and disaster. The team spent hours planning their approach, studying building layouts and coordinating their movements. Sarah contributed significantly to the tactical planning, drawing on her natural ability to visualize complex scenarios and identify potential problems before they occurred. Her suggestions were practical and well-reasoned, earning approval from the team leader and most other members. Marcus, however, seemed determined to undermine her contributions. He questioned her ideas without offering better alternatives, suggested that her small size would be a liability in close-quarters combat, and generally created an atmosphere of tension within the team. The other trainees tried to maintain focus on the mission, but the interpersonal conflict was becoming a distraction. When the exercise began, the team moved through the mock urban environment with practiced precision. They communicated through hand signals and whispered radio transmissions, maintaining the stealth necessary for their mission. Sarah's performance was flawless as she cleared rooms with textbook technique and provided covering fire for her teammates when needed. But as the exercise progressed, Marcus began making increasingly aggressive comments about Sarah's capabilities. He questioned her tactical decisions, criticized her positioning, and generally behaved in a way that compromised team cohesion. The other trainees could see that his behavior was unprofessional, but they were focused on completing their mission successfully. The situation deteriorated further when the team encountered a complex scenario involving multiple hostiles and potential civilian casualties. Sarah quickly identified the optimal approach and began moving to execute it, but Marcus intervened, claiming that her plan was too risky. His interference disrupted the team's coordination and nearly resulted in mission failure. After the exercise concluded, the team gathered for a debriefing session with their instructor, Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, a seasoned SEAL with over 15 years of experience. Rodriguez had been observing the exercise closely and had noticed the dysfunction within the team. His critique was pointed and direct. "Thompson, your behavior during this exercise was unacceptable," Rodriguez stated firmly. "You allowed personal issues to interfere with mission effectiveness. In a real operation, that kind of behavior gets people killed." Marcus's face reddened, but he remained silent as Rodriguez continued his assessment. The instructor praised Sarah's tactical thinking and execution while making it clear that team cohesion was essential for mission success. The message was obvious to everyone present. Marcus's attitude was the problem, not Sarah's presence on the team. After the debriefing, the trainees returned to their barracks to clean their equipment and prepare for the next day's training. The barracks were Spartan accommodations, with rows of bunk beds, lockers for personal gear, and common areas where trainees could study or relax during their limited free time. The atmosphere was usually focused and professional, but tonight there was an underlying tension that everyone could feel. Sarah was methodically cleaning her rifle when Marcus approached her. His usual swagger was replaced by barely contained anger, and his voice carried a threatening tone that she had never heard before. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" Marcus said, his voice low but audible to nearby trainees. "Making me look bad in front of the instructor." Sarah continued her equipment maintenance without looking up. "I'm just trying to do my job, Marcus. Maybe you should focus on doing yours." "My job?" Marcus's voice rose slightly. "My job is to be a SEAL, not to babysit some girl who thinks she can play soldier." Other trainees in the barracks began to take notice of the confrontation. Some moved closer, sensing that the situation was escalating beyond the usual verbal sparring that occurred between trainees. Others seemed uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking and tried to focus on their own activities. Sarah finally looked up from her rifle, her expression calm but alert. "If you have a problem with my performance, You should discuss it with the instructors. This conversation isn't productive. Marcus stepped closer, his physical size becoming more intimidating in the confined space of the barracks. Don't tell me what to do. You don't belong here, and everyone knows it. You're just here to make some political point. I'm here because I earned my place, just like everyone else, Sarah replied evenly. And I'll continue to earn it every day. The exchange was drawing attention from throughout the barracks now. Trainees stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation unfold. Some looked uncomfortable with Marcus's aggressive behavior, while others seemed curious to see how the situation would develop. Marcus's frustration reached a boiling point. Months of watching Sarah succeed where he had expected her to fail, combined with the public criticism from Rodriguez, had pushed him beyond rational thought. His next words crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. You know what your problem is? You think being tough means acting like a man. But underneath all that attitude, you're still just a weak little girl who doesn't know her place. The barracks fell silent. Even trainees who had been sympathetic to Marcus's position recognized that his comment had gone too far. Sarah set down her rifle and stood up slowly, her movements controlled and deliberate. I think this conversation is over, she said quietly. But Marcus wasn't finished. The audience seemed to embolden him rather than encourage restraint. No, I don't think it is. I think it's time someone explained reality to you. He reached out suddenly and grabbed a handful of Sarah's hair, yanking her head back in a gesture that was both physically aggressive and deeply humiliating. Maybe this will help you understand. Marcus never finished his sentence. What happened next occurred so quickly that most observers couldn't follow the sequence of movements. Sarah's reaction was instantaneous, precise, and devastating. Years of martial arts training combined with months of advanced military combat instruction produced a response that was both technically perfect and completely overwhelming. In less than 2 seconds, Marcus found himself on the floor of the barracks, completely incapacitated and struggling to breathe. Sarah stood over him, her posture relaxed but ready, her expression showing no emotion other than complete focus. The entire incident had lasted only moments, but its impact would resonate far beyond that night. The moment Marcus's hand touched Sarah's hair, time seemed to slow down for everyone watching in the barracks. What followed was a display of combat efficiency that would be talked about for years to come, dissected and analyzed by military instructors and psychologists alike. Sarah's response began with a subtle shift in her stance that most observers didn't even notice. Her left foot moved slightly backward, creating a more stable base, while her weight shifted to her right leg. These micro-movements happened in the first fraction of a second, an automatic response drilled into her through years of martial arts training and months of advanced military combat instruction. As Marcus's grip tightened on her hair and he began to pull her head back, Sarah's right hand moved upward in a swift, precise arc. Her palm connected with the underside of Marcus's wrist at exactly the right angle and with perfect timing. The strike didn't look particularly forceful to the casual observer, but it hit a specific pressure point that caused Marcus's hand to reflexively open, immediately releasing her hair. Simultaneously, Sarah's left hand shot forward, her fingers extended and slightly curved. The strike targeted Marcus's solar plexus with surgical precision, hitting the complex of nerves located just below his sternum. The impact drove the air from his lungs and sent shockwaves through his nervous system, causing his diaphragm to spasm and making it temporarily impossible for him to breathe properly. But Sarah wasn't finished. As Marcus began to double over from the solar plexus strike, she stepped slightly to her right and brought her right knee upward in a fluid motion. The knee connected with Marcus's descending face, specifically targeting his nose and upper jaw. The impact was controlled but devastating, causing immediate disorientation and flooding his eyes with tears that made it impossible for him to see clearly. The entire sequence had taken less than 2 seconds, but Marcus was already beginning to fall. Sarah completed her defensive combination with a move that demonstrated both her technical skill and her understanding of body mechanics. As Marcus fell forward from the knee strike, she stepped behind him and used his own momentum against him, guiding his descent with a technique that ensured he would land on the floor in a controlled manner rather than crashing into nearby bunks or lockers. Marcus hit the barracks floor with a heavy thud, his 200-pound frame sprawled awkwardly on the polished concrete. He was conscious, but completely incapacitated, gasping for air that wouldn't come properly and struggling to focus his eyes. His nose was bleeding, though not broken, and his entire body seemed to have forgotten how to coordinate its movements. Sarah stood over him, her breathing steady and her posture relaxed. There was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction or vindication. She looked like a technician who had just completed a routine task, calm and professional. Her movements as she stepped back were fluid and controlled, ready to respond again if necessary, but showing no aggression or desire to continue the confrontation. The silence in the barracks was absolute. 26 other trainees stood frozen, many with their mouths open in shock. Some had been in the middle of cleaning weapons or organizing gear when the incident began, and they remained in those positions like statues. Others had moved closer to watch the confrontation develop, and they now found themselves witnessing something that challenged their understanding of physical capability and combat effectiveness. Tommy Martinez, a trainee from California who had become friends with both Sarah and Marcus, was the first to break the silence. "Holy shit," he whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the quiet space. His words seemed to release the others from their stunned paralysis, and a buzz of conversation began to fill the barracks. "Did you see that?" another trainee asked, his voice filled with awe. "How did she move that fast?" "I couldn't even follow what happened," someone else admitted. One second he grabbed her hair, and the next second he was on the floor. Several trainees moved closer to check on Marcus, who was still struggling to regain his breath and composure. His face was red from the effort of trying to breathe normally, and his eyes were watering so heavily that he couldn't focus on anything around him. He attempted to speak but could only produce a gasping sound that made it clear his diaphragm was still not functioning properly. "Give him space," Sarah said quietly, her first words since the confrontation ended. "His breathing will return to normal in a minute or two. The solar plexus strike causes temporary diaphragm paralysis, but it's not permanent." Her clinical explanation of what she had done only added to the surreal atmosphere in the barracks. She spoke about the combat technique the same way a medical student might describe a procedure, with complete technical understanding but no emotional involvement. James Wilson, a trainee from Ohio who had remained neutral in the ongoing tension between Sarah and Marcus, looked at her with new respect and perhaps a touch of fear. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" he asked. "Martial arts since I was 8. Sarah replied simply, "supplemented by the hand-to-hand combat training we've all received here. When you're smaller than your opponents, you learn to be more efficient." Her matter-of-fact tone made it clear that she didn't consider what had happened to be particularly remarkable. To her, it was simply the application of skills she had been developing her entire life, adapted to address a specific threat in the most efficient way possible. Marcus was beginning to recover somewhat, though he remained on the floor. His breathing was becoming more regular, and he was able to focus his eyes enough to look around the barracks. When his gaze fell on Sarah, standing calmly a few feet away, his expression showed a mixture of humiliation, anger, and something that might have been fear. You, he gasped, still struggling to form complete sentences. "I defended myself," Sarah said simply. "You initiated physical contact in an aggressive manner. I responded appropriately to neutralize the threat." Her use of military terminology to describe the incident was deliberate and effective. By framing her actions in the context of threat assessment and appropriate response, she was establishing a narrative that would be difficult to challenge in any official investigation. Other trainees began to realize the broader implications of what they had witnessed. This wasn't just a barracks fight between two trainees. It was a demonstration that the assumptions many of them had held about physical capability and gender roles in combat situations were fundamentally flawed. Mike Stevens, a trainee from Texas who had initially been skeptical about women in special operations, found himself reevaluating his position. He had watched Sarah's performance throughout training with grudging respect, but seeing her neutralize a much larger opponent with such clinical efficiency forced him to acknowledge that his preconceptions had been wrong. "Jesus, Sarah," he said, shaking his head in amazement.
"I had no idea you could do that."
"Most people don't," Sarah replied. "That's often an advantage in combat situations."
Opponents tend to underestimate threats they don't understand. As Marcus slowly regained his ability to speak and move, the reality of his situation began to sink in. He had initiated a physical confrontation with a fellow trainee, and had been completely dominated in front of their entire class. The humiliation was crushing, but more importantly, he realized that his actions could result in dismissal from the program. Fighting between trainees was strictly prohibited, and the consequences were severe. While Sarah could arguably claim self-defense, Marcus had clearly been the aggressor. His grab of her hair constituted assault under military law, and there were nearly 30 witnesses to his actions. I didn't mean, Marcus began, his voice still weak and shaky. Yes, you did, Sarah interrupted, her tone remaining calm but firm. You meant to intimidate and humiliate me. You chose to use physical force to make your point. The only thing you didn't anticipate was my response. The truth of her words was undeniable, and Marcus found himself without any viable defense for his behavior. He had acted out of frustration and anger, allowing his emotions to override his judgment, and now he faced the consequences of that decision. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside the barracks caused immediate tension. Someone was approaching, and if it was an instructor, the situation was about to become much more serious. All conversation stopped as the trainees listened to the approaching footsteps, wondering if they were about to witness the end of Marcus's military career. The footsteps passed by without stopping, but the brief scare reminded everyone present that their actions had consequences beyond the immediate barracks environment. They were training to become Navy SEALs, members of an elite military unit where discipline and professionalism were absolutely essential. The incident they had just witnessed would need to be addressed, and how it was handled would affect not just Sarah and Marcus, but potentially the entire future of women in special operations training. The aftermath of the confrontation in the barracks created a situation that no one in the SEAL training program had anticipated. As Marcus slowly pulled himself to his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment and his breathing still labored, the other trainees began to process what they had witnessed. The implications extended far beyond a simple altercation between two individuals. Tommy Martinez, who had known both Sarah and Marcus since the beginning of training, found himself in the difficult position of deciding what to do next. Military protocol was clear. Incidents of this nature were supposed to be reported immediately to the chain of command. However, reporting the incident would likely result in Marcus's dismissal from the program, and despite his recent behavior, Tommy had considered him a friend. Look, Tommy said quietly, addressing the group. We all saw what happened here. Marcus grabbed Sarah's hair and she defended herself. The question is, what do we do about it? The silence that followed his question was heavy with tension. Everyone understood the gravity of the situation. SEAL training was about more than individual performance. It was about building a brotherhood of warriors who could trust each other completely. The incident had exposed fractures in that unity that would be difficult to repair. James Wilson, who had remained largely neutral in the ongoing tensions between Sarah and Marcus, stepped forward. We need to be honest about what happened, he said. Marcus was out of line, and Sarah had every right to defend herself. But if we report this, it's going to end his career before it even starts. Sarah listened to the discussion without participating initially. She understood the difficult position her fellow trainees found themselves in, but she also knew that allowing Marcus's behavior to go unreported would send a dangerous message about what was acceptable in their training environment. The decision isn't up to us, she said finally. Military regulations exist for a reason. What happened here tonight was assault, and it was witnessed by nearly 30 people. Pretending it didn't happen doesn't make us a stronger unit. It makes us complicit in behavior that could get people killed in actual combat situations. Marcus, who had been sitting on his bunk holding his head, looked up at Sarah with an expression that mixed anger, shame, and desperation. Please, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I know I screwed up. I know what I did was wrong. But this program is everything to me. My whole life has been leading up to this. The appeal to Sarah's compassion was strategically sound, but it failed to account for her fundamental understanding of what military service meant. She had not endured months of brutal training and years of preparation to be part of an organization that tolerated the kind of behavior Marcus had displayed. Your life led up to this moment, Sarah replied, her tone neither cruel nor sympathetic. And in this moment, you chose to assault a fellow service member because you couldn't handle being outperformed by someone you considered inferior. That choice reveals everything about your character and your suitability for this role. Mike Stevens, who had initially been skeptical about women in special operations but had gradually come to respect Sarah's abilities, found himself facing a fundamental shift in his worldview. The demonstration of combat effectiveness he had just witnessed forced him to confront his own biases and assumptions. "I need to say something," Mike announced to the group. "I came into this program thinking that women didn't belong in special operations. I thought physical differences meant that women would always be liabilities in combat situations. What I just saw proves how wrong I was." He turned to face Sarah directly. "The way you handled that situation was the most professional combat response I've ever witnessed. You neutralized the threat efficiently and proportionally without excessive force or loss of control. That's exactly the kind of skill we're supposed to be developing here." Several other trainees nodded in agreement, adding their voices to Mike's assessment. The demonstration had been more effective than any lecture or training exercise in proving that combat effectiveness wasn't simply a matter of size and strength. As the discussion continued, the sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway became unmistakable. This time, the footsteps stopped directly outside the barracks door, and the authoritative knock that followed left no doubt about who was seeking entry. "Attention!" someone called out, and all the trainees immediately snapped to attention as Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez entered the barracks, followed by two other instructors. Rodriguez's experienced eyes quickly assessed the scene. Marcus's disheveled appearance, the unusual tension in the room, and the way the trainees were positioned told him immediately that something significant had occurred. His gaze moved from trainee to trainee, reading their expressions and body language with the skill of someone who had been evaluating military personnel for over 2 decades. "I received a report of raised voices and unusual activity in this barracks," Rodriguez announced. "Would someone like to explain what happened here?" The silence stretched for several seconds as the trainees wrestled with their conflicting loyalties and obligations. Finally, Sarah stepped forward. "Chief, there was an altercation between Trainee Thompson and myself. He initiated physical contact by grabbing my hair, and I responded with defensive measures to neutralize the threat." Rodriguez's expression didn't change, but his attention focused intently on Sarah. "Describe the defensive measures you employed, Martinez." "I used a pressure point strike to break his grip, followed by a solar plexus strike and a controlled knee strike to disorient the attacker. I then guided his fall to prevent injury to him or damage to equipment. The entire sequence lasted approximately 2 seconds." The clinical precision of Sarah's report impressed Rodriguez, but he wasn't finished with his investigation. "Thompson, is Martinez's account accurate?" Marcus struggled with his response. Admitting that Sarah's account was accurate would essentially confess to assault, but lying in front of 30 witnesses would be even worse. "Yes, Chief," he said quietly. "That's what happened." "And what prompted you to grab Martinez's hair?" Rodriguez asked, his tone carrying the weight of command authority. Marcus's explanation came out in a halting, disjointed manner that revealed his emotional state and poor judgment. He spoke about feeling undermined, about believing Sarah received special treatment, and about his frustration with her performance exceeding his own. With each word, he dug himself deeper into a hole that he couldn't escape. Rodriguez listened without interruption, allowing Marcus to fully incriminate himself. When the explanation was complete, the chief turned his attention back to the group as a whole. "In my 23 years of military service, I have seen many examples of poor judgment and unprofessional behavior," Rodriguez began. "However, I have rarely seen such a clear-cut case of assault between service members, or such a textbook example of appropriate defensive response." He paused to let his words sink in before continuing. "Thompson, you are dismissed from this program effective immediately. Pack your gear and report to the administration office within 1 hour. Security will escort you off the base." The finality of Rodriguez's pronouncement hit the barracks like a physical blow. Despite everything that had happened, many of the trainees had hoped that Marcus might receive a second chance. The reality of military justice was harsher than civilian sensibilities. "Martinez," Rodriguez continued, "your response to Thompson's assault was professionally executed and entirely appropriate. However, I want to see you in my office tomorrow morning to discuss the broader implications of this incident." As Rodriguez and the other instructors left the barracks, The trainees were left to process the rapid conclusion to the evening's events. Marcus began packing his gear in silence, his military career effectively over before it had truly begun. Other trainees watched uncomfortably, some offering quiet words of support while others maintained their distance. Sarah returned to cleaning her rifle, her demeanor unchanged from before the confrontation. She understood that the incident would have lasting implications for her own career and for the future of women in special operations, but she also knew that she had responded correctly to an unacceptable situation. Over the following weeks, news of the incident spread throughout the special operations community. Sarah's demonstration of combat effectiveness became a case study in military training programs, cited as evidence that physical size alone was not the determining factor in combat capability. More importantly, the incident marked a turning point in attitudes toward women in special operations roles. The clear-cut nature of the confrontation, with Sarah responding appropriately to an unprovoked assault, made it difficult for critics to argue that gender integration was inherently problematic. Sarah went on to complete SEAL training successfully, becoming the first woman to earn the coveted Trident insignia. Her achievement opened doors for other women and helped establish new standards for evaluating combat capability that focused on skill, intelligence, and mental toughness rather than traditional physical metrics. Years later, when military historians analyzed the evolution of special operations forces, they often pointed to the barracks incident as a pivotal moment. It demonstrated that true warrior capability transcended gender stereotypes, and that the most effective fighters were those who combined physical skill with mental discipline and professional integrity. Marcus Thompson's military career ended that night in the barracks, but his role in history was secured as the man whose poor judgment and inability to accept equality provided the catalyst for meaningful change in one of the military's most elite organizations. His few seconds of aggressive behavior resulted in a demonstration that would be remembered and studied for decades to come, proving that sometimes the most important victories are won not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when individuals choose to stand up for what is right.